Fabulous. I think we'll go ahead and begin. We have a great set of panelists. We have a tremendous set of participants also. Good to see Rutula Shaw and so many of you here. Thank you for all joining us. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. I am especially excited about this topic. I'm glad that we can have a panel on democracy and foreign policy. I think there was a period of time where people didn't think that it would be a serious discussion. I think you will learn very rapidly from the people on the panel that it's always been a serious discussion to have below the level of headlines when it comes not only to US foreign policy, but certainly to Europe's foreign policy. And you'll note that we have our director on the panel for very good reason, which is not only his deep experience working on Europe and Europe's foreign policy, but also his recent writings on democracy in light of COVID-19. Our first speaker, Dr. Dan Twining, is the president of the International Republican Institute. I'm sure he's very well known to you. He's had a long and important career in Washington and the policy planning staff, the German Marshall Fund, working on Asia, and is, one of our most important contributors to public and intellectual and policy debates on the role of democracy. We then have Ambassador Victoria Nuland, and again, who are welcoming back to Chatham House, very well known to many of my colleagues, not least James Nixie, who's on the call with us, who directs our Russia and Eurasia program. Also Tom Raines, who directs our Europe program, is here on the call. You can see that people are very interested to hear from you, Victoria. Ambassador Nuland was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasia Affairs from 2013 to 2017. Nobody needs to tell this audience how important those years were. But of course, as you know, she was also previously the US ambassador to NATO, and she worked very hard throughout the 1990s when there was that magnificent effort to extend the post-war order and to open up the door and the opportunity of democracy to so many countries. Victoria, I know that you were a really key part of that work in Washington. So your expertise, I know you're now at Brookings, lucky them, as a non-resident fellow and doing many other things. And then Dr. Robin Niblett, the director and chief executive of Chatham House, a favorite here on our Zooms, usually hosting them, but it's very nice to be able to actually bring our people into the speaker's chair as well as the convener's chair, because of course the level of expertise and knowledge that's accumulated over a lifetime, not only at Chatham House, but working in Washington for many years, leading the Europe program at CSIS and as the COO there. There's a lot to be said, I think, and we wanted to be sure in this discussion that there is a European response to this conversation about democracy and US foreign policy. Let me just say a couple of things before I turn it over to Dan Twining. There's, as we know, 14 years of decline in democracy globally. In 2017, our focus shifted and we began, or really perhaps 2016, we began to worry about democracy, not only in places like Russia, Egypt, Turkey, and beyond, but we really started to look at our own democracies. And this panel is really asking the question of democracy in our foreign policies, but I think there is a very fundamental question to be asked about what limitation there is placed on the United States when people don't believe outlookers, those of us sitting in Europe looking at US perhaps too much through the lens of the headlines, but nonetheless, that is much of what's dominating America's international affairs right now. And there is a genuine question about the extent to which America's own performance when it comes to democracy cripples its capacity to engage in democracy through its foreign policy. The second thing I would say is that, as we know, the democracy agenda got mixed up with questions of the use of military force for a very long period of time, first and most obviously in Iraq, but all the way through, I would say, until the intervention in Libya, which was ostensibly under the notion, in part, of the responsibility to protect. It's a slightly more complicated story. But I think that was also a reason why it's become complicated, as we know, to talk about democracy in the context of US foreign policy. The reason we have Dan Twining here to start us out is because there are other levers and other mechanisms through which the US seeks to encourage or support or engage with the question of democracy and its foreign policy. And unfortunately, those don't get the same amount of attention and airtime but it's a very important conversation, not only in the current administration and the current period, but clearly for our audiences here in the UK, and those of you joining from the continent and elsewhere, not least David Manning, who's the chair of the North America Advisory Council, and very important to us here, but I think is still in France. It's very important to those of us who are watching America to understand where you think things are going to go after the November elections on this question of democracy and US foreign policy. So with that, let me turn it immediately to you, Dan, to give us, I don't know, maybe the good news story, but at least the details and your thoughts on this broader area, which is so important. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Robin and Toria and so many friends. You know, I came to the UK as a young chap on a Fulbright scholarship once upon a time, and I voted with my feet on which was America's most important friend and ally in the world, and I still feel that way. So thank you all. Maybe I could begin with just a quick word about kind of what's happening in America, because we're having a conversation about democracy and kind of democracy and foreign policy, and how it links very directly to that. And I'm happy to come back to this, but just very briefly, just to put it on the table, you know, Americans have been protesting for greater rights and freedoms since the 18th century, you know, since the time British redcoats were marching down our streets. The Alien and Sedition Acts created America's first mass movement in 1798 of popular protest against the new US government. So what we see on the streets of America today, to me, is kind of a continuation of 2.5 centuries of people demanding greater rights and equal justice and greater freedoms. And that's really something to be welcomed. Americans care about democracy and human rights in the world because we care about them at home. I mean, I know the same thing is true in the UK. It would be funny if we didn't care about them at home at least as much as we care about them in the world. So I'm happy to circle back on that. I would just like to make a couple quick points. One, even if we don't care, we do care. But even if there are people in our countries who don't think democracy should be a central component of foreign policy, I just want to say very clearly that in the Kremlin and in the Chinese Communist Party leadership, they do not want democracy to be part of Western foreign policy. We know that because the Kremlin and the CCP in different ways are running extensive operations globally, influence operations, disinformation operations, various forms of cyber operations to attack our own democracy, to assault the principle that people should be free to choose who their leaders are. And of course, the greatest threat, if you're Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, is the idea of people choosing their own leaders. Another great threat, incidentally, is the idea of policemen and soldiers kneeling in the streets in solidarity with protesters, the kind of thing you've seen peacefully in the United States. That's the worst nightmare of an autocrat abroad. So our competitors care deeply about disrupting democracy and essentially creating a new international standard that is sort of a value-free zone in which their various forms of kleptocratic and autocratic rule is safe, in which they can build out spheres of influence that repress free people and free societies, and in which the West, including the US and the UK, do not have standing to comment on their abuses of their own people. So that's how our competitors see the role of values in foreign policy. They actually see them as quite central. And I would say that's a reason for us, frankly, to double down on them. When we think about the world that we are in, that we are looking out at over the coming few decades, you know, I think the Trump national security strategy is right, which is that we are looking at a new era of great power competition. And as I've mentioned, those great power adversaries are using what the National Endowment for Democracy calls sharp power instruments. They are not using primarily military force. They are not using primarily kind of the traditional instruments of statecraft in many regards. They are using these sharp power tools of media censorship and kind of projecting that abroad, of bringing corruption into free societies, of doing elite capture in third countries to buy off leaders so that they can build out their own illiberal spheres of influence. So this is what some of the competition is doing with sharp power instruments. I do think there's a pretty compelling case for us in the West including in the United States, to be investing in our instruments that support free and open societies. I'm happy to tell you that US funding for democracy support in the world is a lot higher than it was, say, during the Obama administration, that Congress has really made critical investments in instruments like the National Endowment for Democracy, the Democracy and Human Rights accounts in the USAID, the US Agency for International Development, the State Department, and elsewhere. So despite some of the headlines that Leslie mentioned, and I'm certainly happy to get into them, there is, I think, a broad and bipartisan recognition in the United States at various levels of leadership that democracy should be a central component of foreign policy. We know from polling done by the Penn Biden Center, the Bush Institute, Freedom House, and other groups that actually substantial majorities, supermajorities of Americans believe democracy should be a component of foreign policy. 2/3 of Americans understand the link between a more democratic world out there and a safer world for our own way of life at home. So there's really broad bipartisan support for the principle that Americans should care about the rights and freedoms of other people, not just of ourselves. So let me just close, looking forward to hearing from Toria Nuland, just with the proposition that if we didn't really have some of these democracy instruments now, we would need to reinvent them. And one reason why is, frankly, it's not great power competition. It's not a top-down argument. It's a bottom-up argument. 2019 into early 2020, before COVID shut so many things down, saw the greatest demonstration of people power, of street protests around the world than at any time since the end of the Cold War, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, really just for the past year until COVID shut things down, we were living through a new period of popular ferment in which people all over the world were demanding greater rights and freedoms. And that wasn't just in, sort of nice, easy countries. That was true in places like Hong Kong, where 2 million people took to the streets in defiance of the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to suppress that society. That was true in Sudan, which had a peaceful street revolution that deposed a war criminal tyrant leader. That has been true in countries like Algeria. It's been true in countries like Venezuela and Bolivia. It's been true in countries like Armenia. But around the world, on almost every continent, you have seen a resurgence of democratic activism. And so I know it's a trendy argument to say that democracy is somehow in decline and in retreat and authoritarians are on the march everywhere. But that's not what it looks like when you go out and talk to people in the world and you see all the energy around people demanding the human dignity that comes from democratic freedoms. And America is going to continue to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I mean, I think you have a lot on the table. I'm sure we're going to hear, I don't know, some corrections, maybe a different story, maybe a development of that story. But certainly for our audiences, I think the idea that the amount of overall budget allocated to some of these activities is higher is not a story that's well told, and it will be interesting to hear perhaps more about the detail of that. My second reaction very quickly is sometimes people are out on the streets demanding things when they feel that they're more at risk. And so I do have a question for you that we can come back to perhaps of, to what extent do you think that there is a sort of, a liberal backlash or a backlash that if you believe in democracy or you think it's the best way to go is a product of greater restrictions, or whether this is just, part of an ongoing story as to the direction of travel in many transitional states. But Ambassador Nuland, we're all very curious to hear from you.
Well, thanks, Leslie, and thanks to Chatham House. It's great to be here. Dan started with his UK credentials. He cannot beat mine. I have a British mom, and her first memory is of lying in the air raid shelters with her father, lying across all the kids during World War II. So I am very much imbued with the spirit of the US-UK link and love to work with Chatham House. And great to see so many comrades from the UK side on the screen, Sir David Manning, Sir John Sawyers, Jamie Shea, many people that I've worked with together over the years. So the problem for Chatham House when they invite Dan Twining and Toria Nuland to the same panel is that we basically agree. And we have worked together on and off for many years on these issues, and we now work together. I'm on the National Endowment for Democracy Board. He obviously runs IRI, so we're very much involved in these US programs to support democratic green shoots all over the world, no matter what form they take. But I want to start where Dan started, which is in the United States, because what is happening here, what happened here over the last month, is in fact, much as Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi have enjoyed having pictures of American ferment and American rending of our own fabric on their television screens, the fact that we have been able to have protests that have been mostly peaceful or were peaceful after the first couple of days all over the country is something that their citizens do not enjoy. And the fact that those protests are already turning into at both the federal level and the state level, attention to regulation and policy and guidance to improve not only policing, but racial opportunity, diversity, et cetera, with virtually no leadership from the White House or anti-leadership, you might say. That said, we all know, all of us who work on these issues, that democracy is hard. It's not the natural state. It's far easier for humans to be run by strongman rule. And so it has to be fought for in every generation, and it has to be perfected in every country. And I think the most difficult thing now is that the US has abandoned its traditional leadership role here, or certainly the leadership role that it has played across Republican and Democratic administrations for 70 plus years. And not only has it abandoned its role, but it is working against democratic principles, both in the way the administration and the president speak about governance in the United States, but also about who and what we support at the national level overseas. And this is not a partisan comment, this is a factual comment. You know, I spent my career, 32 plus years, in the US diplomatic service, talking to other governments, talking to other people around the world who wanted the security and the prosperity and the freedom that we had about the basic tenets of how you get there. And it's not simply, as everybody knows, about regular elections and alternations of power and political pluralism at the party level. It is also about support for a free press, an independent judiciary, an apolitical military, as leaders serving your people, not serving yourself, being transparent about your assets, not hiring your children. So, you know, it's very difficult to watch all of these basic tenets of democracy under threat in my own country from the president himself. So the question becomes how we regain this sense of community around democracy. And what I worry about is that in too many parts of the world, those free nations that ought to be picking up the mantle of being that beacon for all of these principles are either too worried about their own internal situation now, for very good reason, combination of COVID and economic recession, et cetera, Brexit, you know, the integrity of the EU and its future, or they are worried about being squeezed between a more selfish United States and a marching China to actually pick up that mantle. So if you look at trends within the European Union, you know, particularly if the president is reelected here in November, will the EU and the UK together, if they can find a way back to joint work globally, support and defend these basic principles, including within the European Union, where we have Hungary and Poland, and within the NATO family, where we have Turkey facing serious rollback to their democracy? Or will they take the wrong lessons from what's going on in the United States and from the growing strength of China and decide to be more protectionist themselves, not take on these worries and dangers, not address the issues that are corrosive to democracy, like income inequality, like technology, which must be, the new tech economy must be defended in terms of a space that favors freedom rather than a space that favors autocrats. And that's going to take hard work, and it's going to take a serious dialogue that we ought to be leading in the United States, but for obvious reasons we are not, between government, industry, and consumers. So, I see a very important and strong agenda for the democratic and free world to rebuild its strength and to take on these issues and to build back better, whether it's on the economic side, release the power of innovation and technology to strengthen our economies in an open and transparent way, not a closed and protectionist way, and force the autocrats to compete on a playing field that we dictate rather than a playing field they dictate. As I said, the second piece to ensure that the digital transformation is one that is equally shared, is one that favors freedom, and is one that blocks and tackles either the authoritarians' desire to abuse it or the haters and the terrorists, et cetera, effort to abuse it. And that's going to take democratic unity and democratic attention, and this combination of effort between government, industry, and citizens. And then the last piece is China, and to a lesser extent Russia, who, as Dan made clear, are both trying to change the terms of the global system to protect and defend autocracies. And that is objectively not in our interest. But it's also not an insurmountable problem if we are unified and if we make the global system that we built work for freedom, rather than turning our backs on the WTO, the WHO, NATO, the US, UK, EU relationship, using our military strength to keep sea lanes open, to defend vulnerable people, not to turn our military onto our own, et cetera. So there's a lot of work to be done. It can be done, but it requires leadership that we don't have at the moment in the US. I don't think we have it on the other side of the pond. So we have to decide, are we going to make this choice? And interestingly, as Dan said, citizens are increasingly pushing for more support for rights, more support for opportunity, more support for diversity, more support for tolerance, even as our governments often go in the opposite direction. I will pause there.
Let me ask Dan and Victoria one question, and then I'm going to come right to Robin, who might also add his views on this question. Do you think that the current global institutions, the international institutions, the regional institutions, such as we have them, are fit for purpose? Are they good enough when it comes to both encouraging and enabling cooperation amongst democracies to manage the big global questions? And would you, as we move into a next administration, whether it's a second Trump administration or as it looks like it will be if the election were tomorrow, a Biden administration, would you be an advocate of creating some additional or new mechanism for either democracy promotion or for democracies to collectively participate and work together? Maybe Dan, you want to take that first.
So I think multilateralism is going to be more important than ever in this emerging world. I don't think, frankly, a lot of the institutions that we inherited that were built in a different time, in a different world, are fit for purpose. No. There's part of the issue here is the way China has abused, actually, frankly, quite effective institutions like the World Trade Organization, not following the rules. The value, a very distinguished commission a few years ago estimated that the value of Chinese intellectual piracy from US companies was greater than the value of American exports to Asia in any given year. This was during the Obama administration. So the argument was that the Chinese were stealing more by value from American companies than all of Asia was buying by value from the United States. The World Health Organization, the US is the world's biggest health donor it's 5 times ahead of the next biggest donor. In 2018, 2019, in that funding cycle, the US gave 10 times more in contributions to the World Health Organization. But guess what? 60% of people in the world, I saw in a poll yesterday, think China is the top world health donor, not the generous American people. So part of, I think, what we're struggling with in the United States is, do we walk away from these institutions? I hope the answer is no. Do we double down in trying to modernize them and make them more effective? I hope the answer is yes. We've seen the Chinese run campaigns in a lot of these very technical functional agencies. They seem to think that setting regulatory standards globally is quite important. I hope we do too. But finally, Leslie, I would just say one thing that we know works, a lot of the existing architecture doesn't work very well. One thing we know works is like-minded coalitions. You have just had a set of meetings by this Quad Plus in Asia, which is the US, Japan, India, Australia, plus now a few other countries, including South Korea. You have some different COVID pandemic response groups that have formed among the world's leading democracies. When there are like-minded equities at stake, I think multilateralism, minilateralism, if you will, can go very far. But the existing architecture is woefully insufficient, I'm sorry to say.
Victoria.
I hate to rip up what you have without the ability to recreate. Having worked at NATO for many years with colleagues on the screen, these institutions are capable of adaptation. NATO went from a static entity to an entity that fought for the first time to prevent genocide in the Balkans and then went thousands of miles afield for Afghanistan, not perfectly, but certainly collectively and better than it would have been if any of us had tried to tackle these problems alone. So I am a big believer in investing in the institutions to make them work and not standing by and letting them disintegrate or letting them be taken over by forces or countries whose agenda does not match the treaty or the charter that they signed. So I think it's about unity in reforming and revising the institutions that we have, but we have to have coalitions of common interest within those organizations led by the democracies and frankly led by the United States to coordinate positions and to prevent some of this stuff from happening. And now with Brexit, it changes the complexion of the US-EU relationship. We're going to have to figure out a way to create a three-legged stool, if you will, the US, the UK, and the EU. And I've long been somebody who's favored EU-NATO fusion because on many of these problems, including things like COVID, the tools that Europeans have are held on the EU side. The tools of common health policy, et cetera, and investments. So, but I agree with Dan on one point, which is coalitions of common interest are often effective. You can start with a small core and then build. I think this is where we're going to have to go on tech policy and tech regulation. But we have to, first and foremost, as a free and democratic community, not stand by and let the institutions that we have corrode from the inside, whether it's NATO because too many of its members wouldn't get in today because they're not living up to the terms of the charter, including sometimes my own country, or whether it is the WTO, which we've allowed to fall apart. And frankly, the World Health Organization, I don't agree with the US pulling out, but we certainly should never have allowed too much of the agenda to have been taken over by one country. And, that began on Obama's watch, but it certainly accelerated on Trump's watch. So I think particularly at the G7 level, which are the biggest, most aligned democracies representing a huge amount of economic power, we ought to harness that brain collective where the table is small enough for leaders to actually have a conversation, to agree on a common strategy to defend democracy in all of these institutions, and then go back out into the institutions and seed those policies together and stay united around them.
So Robin, you're left holding the mantelpiece for all of Europe, for the UK. Brexit is on the table. Those of us who have followed Europe for many years used to look to Europe as the unique power that promoted democracy through its soft power and all other sorts of mechanisms. That conversation isn't one that we hear very much about. Maybe it's still there and we're just not hearing about it. But you've clearly got a lot of questions about Britain's insular focus and Brexit. And I guess implicitly you have a question about whether the UK should be part of or will be part of this effort to double down on existing institutions, but working within them with coalitions of democracies. And then also, you know, what is your view based here in the UK leading such an extraordinary think tank as ours, as you watch the US debate on democracy and as you watch perhaps the beginning of a transition to a new administration?
Well, thank you for that additional introduction. I was going to, and I will luckily start with where you finished, because you went there. Thank you, Leslie, for letting me say something on the main exam question, which is, let's say, my perspective as a European of America's commitments and engagement between foreign policy and democracy. But a quick, obviously, note to say how pleased I am to see Dan with us today. And great to have you virtually in London, and obviously Tori as well, our two Anglo-US people. Very appropriate, I'd say, in our centenary year, given that Chatham House was very much born as an idea that was an Anglo-UK idea at its infancy. So great to be having that conversation with both of you today. And I was looking through the participants list, and I was going to, how good it was to see one or two of our senior advisors, but I notice we have 8 on the call, so I'm not going to call them out. But I will say welcome to Andreas Michaelis, the new German ambassador. I think it's the first, certainly the first Chatham House Zoom meeting I've had the pleasure of having him with us in. So welcome to London, Ambassador. Look forward to your remarks when you want to. It doesn't have to be on this call, obviously. But great to be here. Look, a few quick remarks. I want to say 3 things, I suppose, about the exam question, and I suppose from a European perspective. And the first and most obvious thing to say is that, you know, as the US being one of the world's oldest democracies, you could say most perfectly formed in the extent to which it has separation of powers embedded at the core of its explicit constitution, unlike our somewhat unexplicit one in the UK, means that it really has acted as the kind of beacon on the hill. And I'd say almost that's been its biggest foreign policy impact, has been as a beacon on the hill of what democracy should really look like, what freedom can deliver, freedom of expression, freedom of life, freedom from excessive government interference, and the benefits that it can deliver. And obviously the other dimension as a consumer, almost American foreign policy, has been its capacity in recent decades to protect democracy from fascism and totalitarianism. And as Europeans, we feel it, we remember it, we know it, we're forever grateful, and we still see its manifestation in NATO through the Cold War. And it wasn't just Europeans, obviously democracies in Asia as well that were brought up under American protection benefited from it. And after the Cold War, we had that amazing moment where America was one of the big pushers of democratization around the world into countries from Latin America to Southeast Asia that felt its power, its influence, its presence through the tireless work of many of its diplomats, and where you could argue it kind of made up, and this is where I do my slight pivot, for some of the contradictions that had to exist in any country's foreign policy between wanting to be in favor of democracy, your own system, but also having to run a foreign policy that meant that during the Cold War, that sometimes meant having to ally with countries that were not democracies. We're now obviously in a more contested space, my second point. And I'd say that the contradictions between America's internal values and its beacon on the hill role and its foreign policy interests have become more stark. I think Dan would appreciate, even though we're not going to go on about it too long, this is a moment right now, I think, of a president with a particular view. It's not America. It's not the Republican Party that I recognize from my time back there either, but it is one that has really made democracy irrelevant. I certainly didn't feel, I hope I'm not being unfair on this comment, that democracy promotion at least was core to the Obama presidency, but it has certainly been thrown overboard by this administration, not least as it thinks about how to use, in a way, a reset with Russia in order at one point to toughen up on China. I'd say certainly that's been an impression of what the president might have wanted to do. But even on China, we're never quite sure whether it's a trade agenda or whether it is actually a foreign policy agenda that wants to punish China for its excesses domestically and internationally. And obviously, as long as you buy weapons from the Trump administration, you generally get the thumbs up, whatever your system of government is. So it's been a pretty brutal wake-up time for Europeans who've always been aware of American power, but have suddenly seen the dissonance between the values that previous administrations have represented and this one, with using its power to much more mercantilist utilitarian ends. Now, what's happened, of course, is Europeans in many cases have gone, well, this is a more dog-eat-dog world. Maybe we need to adjust a little bit. Maybe we need to get closer to President Sisi in Egypt, because maybe that's our neighborhood and we need to set the values to one side. Or maybe we should cozy up a bit closer to Russia because China maybe is the new enemy. And if the Trump administration says it's okay to take that line, maybe we should take it too. So you can see European foreign policy starting to wobble, I'd say, and debate itself a little bit on the right track. My concern looking ahead, my main concern almost, is that there's a risk that an against China new American foreign policy starts to carry some of the weaknesses and contradictions that an against the Soviet Union foreign policy did in the Cold War. During the Cold War, as long as you were against the Soviet Union, you ended up being okay. And if you were, whether you were a nationalist, if your nationalism got support from the Soviet Union, then you were bad. And the United States, as we saw in Central America in particular, would support the authoritarian regime. There's a danger that as China, which has manifestly interfered in all sorts of ways with international order, obviously we know what it does domestically in the more excessive steps that have been taken on Xi Jinping. But the danger is that if China is the enemy in the way the Soviet Union was during the period of the Cold War, then anyone on our side must be on our side, and that comes first before democracy. So this won't just be something we see necessarily in Saudi Arabia and other obvious contradictions between all of our foreign policy, UK, European, the lot, and America and our values, but this could stretch into a broader anti-Belt and Road initiative. Maybe if, a government in Sri Lanka that is less democratic but says that it'll keep China out, then maybe we turn in the direction of that government because at least it's keeping China out. Maybe the Vietnamese government isn't quite so bad because at least the Vietnamese government is taking on the Chinese. Maybe in India, that ends up espousing a more ethno-nationalist line is one that we think is okay because at least they're going to be tough on China. I just hope we do not, an American foreign policy does not repeat some of the mistakes that were made in the Cold War, because it will make it very difficult, apart from it being wrong per se, it will also then complicate the capacity for a transatlantic response to the obvious threats that both China, Russia, and other authoritarian states present to us. So if I were just to look ahead and try and close up here, kind of beyond this election, what I think Europeans are crying out for is an America that, again, continues to represent the beacon on the hill. This is a difficult moment. COVID has exposed the inequalities that exist in America as they do in UK and many other countries. It's exposed some of the dysfunctionality of its federal government system. It's exposed the original sin, which Americans call it this, of racism and of slavery not being fully recovered in all sorts of systemic ways within society. And I'm afeared in the lead up to the 2020 election, we'll see some of the gerrymandering, role of money stuff, that voter suppression that many Europeans can't quite believe still takes place in parts of the United States, but is part of its more rough and tumble form of democracy. So we've got to kind of get through that phase where America kind of sorts itself through this election, and then look ahead. And I think on foreign policy and future American capacity to embed democracy into its foreign policy, I say there's two things in particular. Number one, any American administration has to focus right now on protecting democracy. It's not so much about promoting it. I think, as Dan was saying earlier, and Toria was implying, democracies are under threat around the world. And the key role I see the United States having to do, especially with Europeans, is standing alongside to protect democracies in Central Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, but more broadly in Latin America. You know, even from an alliance standpoint, Japan, South Korea, who are going to feel the pressure of a more assertive China. So the protective role, I think, is essential. And the second, which is very much an IRI and National Endowment of Democracy space, it's not so much in my mind about democracy promotion, it's about creating the right environment within which more accountable government can be developed, and institutions and civil society. So this is about anti-corruption, again, something I'm afraid the Trump administration, I think, has not covered itself in glory on. And by the way, Europeans have their own problems in this space as well. But anti-corruption, tax transparency, a thoughtful trade policy that would engage these countries in ways that, again, promotes openness and engagement. Even if they're not democracies yet, they could be democracies in the future. And I thought Toria's comments about technology were particularly important. Do we develop almost a more extraterritorial approach to thinking about our own technology companies? Democracies are being undermined around the world, but authoritarian states are being upheld by misuse of technology, content management, extreme forms of surveillance. And to the extent to which European and American companies end up participating in that process, because that's how they get business and market share, is that something we're going to sit comfortably by and accept? We need to really sort of upgrade our thinking of what will support democracy around the world. And then I think, you know, you don't have to promote it, you've got to create the right environment. And that would be a very strong agenda for America and Europe to start working together again. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Tremendous comments. And of course, I think it in part also goes to the reality that democracy promotion has gotten tinged by the sense that that means the use of military force, when in fact, perhaps the distinction between protection and promotion isn't as dramatic when you start thinking about the other instruments through which you use to protect democracies. But of course, the devil at some level is in the detail. I think the nuance is very important. I'm going to open straight up for questions because we do have so many tremendous people on the call. If you happen to have a video link, please turn it on because it's great to see people who are asking questions. I am going to ask you to use your own voice. If you write your name as opposed to your question into the chat line, we will call on you. And be sure to unmute. I'll start with Aricia, and if you can introduce yourselves as you ask your question. So Aricia is first.
Hi, thanks, Leslie. I'm sorry, I cannot show my video for some reason. Doesn't show in this webinar as an option, so apologies for that. But thank you so much, and great to see Victoria, especially on this call, remembering, you know, the hard work she was doing actually to protect Ukraine's democracy at times of a very vicious attack from the Kremlin. And I would like to ask the question because, in a way, Ukrainians often speak of being at the front line of defending democracy, Western values, being, you know, in a way, a beacon on the other side of Europe for those values. And how would you, specifically addressing Victoria, evaluate the efforts of the collective West to stand by Ukraine? And do you see any risks to erosion of that support over time? As you know, we're all used to military conflict that now lasts for 7 years in Donbass with no light to an end of it. Thank you very much.
Great to see you, Aricia. And, you know, I just read a piece for Foreign Affairs on Russia policy and the collective failure to deal with Putin and pin him down. And in that piece, I made the point that Ukraine remains a front line in our democratic struggle globally. Aricia, I will say that I do worry that attention to Ukraine is is weakening, is fading, that in staying sort of at status quo attention, and with the Ukraine having become so politicized inside the United States, so we almost can't lead there anymore, can't have hobbled ourselves, that Ukraine doesn't have the strength of partnership that it enjoyed in the early years of its current struggle for freedom. I see Andreas Michaelis is here. He was my partner during that time, and I'm very proud of the work that we did together. But I would also say that the number one front for democracy in Ukraine is in the hands of Ukrainians. You have again and again stood up for cleaner government, more European integration, less state control, more devolved power, more opportunity, etc. I worry that we are again in a period where there are mixed views inside Ukraine and mixed views inside the Ukrainian leadership as to how much to fight for a clean and just and European Ukraine. So even as we think about how we can strengthen our support, particularly after the election here, and as we think about how to get back together with Europeans in a common policy, which I think will be necessary, I would urge Ukrainians to continue to fight for those basic things that distinguish you from Putin's Russia, and keep walking towards Europe and a cleaner, more just state.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to add a comment to that. I know we have James Nixie next. And again, I'll say, please do introduce yourself and your affiliation when you speak. We'll come to James, and then I'll come back to all the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I also don't know how to put my monitor on. How strange. And yes, I do have a follow-on question. Thank you, Victoria. James Nixie, Director, Russia and Eurasia Program, Chatham House. And it leads on from my colleague Aricia's question. Because Victoria, I read your Foreign Affairs article, and I must say it is outstanding. So thank you very much for that. And you really had some tremendous ideas for how one can approach Russia. I thought, your idea of visa-free travel for young Russians was a terrific idea, and I hope those things go ahead. And nobody could ever, of course, accuse you of being soft on Russia in any sense whatsoever. But I did want to ask you about that, your point in that article. I hope it's not illegitimate asking about your article, not about what you've just been saying. But because you do also, in the article, Victoria, say that the next US president, whoever he or she, whoever he is, will and should.
It's going to be a dude, regardless.
Yeah, exactly. You say the next US president will and should try again with Putin. You spend most of the article, excoriating Russia for its crimes and misdemeanors. So what I haven't understood, Victoria, is how you square Russia's crimes and misdemeanors, your entire experience of dealing with Russia and what is it Putin wants, having no interest in democracy whatsoever, how it's possible to try again. I suppose you do attack fatalists in your article. I suppose that may include me. I probably have a more fatalistic attitude out of experience with Russia than even you do. But I still haven't understood how you square the idea that you should try again with Putin, not with Russia, but with Putin, with your deep understanding of that country.
Let's hear from perhaps all the panelists on this, but we'll start with you, Victoria.
Well, thanks for that. Look, it is traditional after any presidential election to try to start again with Russia, to try one more time, whether you want to call it a reset, whether you want to call it a testing of the parameters of opportunity. You'll note that the piece includes three essential elements, which I believe have been fundamental to every successful era of U.S. and allied foreign policy with the Kremlin, with Moscow. The first is unity and strength among ourselves, and raising the costs for aggressive behavior, threatening behavior, whether it is interference in our democracies, murdering your opponents on our soil, standing with dictators around the world in Syria, Venezuela, Libya, whether it is Ukraine and Donbass and other threatening behavior towards neighbors, that we need to raise the cost collectively. But at the same time, every successful US opportunity with Russia and with Moscow, as we have defended ourselves more strongly, I also speak for maintaining strong defense budgets, making sure that we are dealing with Russian breakout of arms control, our own breakout of arms control, and dealing with the conventional gap now. As you are standing on a stronger, more costly platform, more united platform as a democratic family in dealing with Moscow, to make clear that a different course chosen by the Kremlin will offer concrete benefits. So to put, as we say, and I stole this directly from Andreas Michaelis, to put in the window what a better relationship might look like, including the trade benefits that might accrue, the benefits for citizens that might accrue. I do make this point that we don't want Putin to define us for young Russians. So one benefit might be visa-free travel for Russians 16 to 22, that kind of thing. And then the third policy is not to let the Kremlin define the relationship for its people, but to broaden the outreach and our own ability to speak directly to Russians, which is actually far easier than it's ever been as more and more of them move to digital platforms, and to make the case that it is their own government that is denying them the security and the prosperity and the integration and the opportunity that would come with better relations from us, and that they, are not being fed and clothed and grown on great patriotic war nostalgia or even on foreign adventures like Donbass, Crimea, and Syria, that they will have a better quality of life if the Kremlin were to change course. Whether they do or not is a choice that we should put to them, but the choice should be made very, very clear, as well as the benefits. And we should not have a conversation only with Putin. We should have a conversation with all of Russia, because after all, it is their future and their opportunity that's being stolen by bad leadership and bad governance, as it has for on and off for 1,000 years. In that poor, beleaguered country. So those are the points that I'm trying to make, and I do think we have to learn to hold both all those thoughts in our mind at the same time, but mostly we have to be confident, as we do need to be with China, that we can set the rules of the road and that we can block and tackle bad behavior and contain it, if not roll it back, if we stay together and if we're strong and if we pay consistent attention.
Dan, would you like to add to this, or?
I'm reluctant to get in the middle of a conversation between two Kremlinologists, but maybe I could just add a couple salient points just to reinforce, I think, what both James and Toria have argued. One is there's recent Levada Center polling showing 6 in 10 Russians want a decisive change in Russia. And first, in Russia, you got to be kind of brave to tell the truth to a pollster. Putin does not hold a majority of public opinion in that country. He is suppressing it with force. He's had a terrible year. The economy is in bad shape. Public health is in bad shape. His foreign adventurism has run awry. And so I think this distinction between our interest in engaging the Russian people, which Toria underlined, we've always got to distinguish between that and this oligarchic kleptocracy at the top that is running the country into the ground. I would like to just highlight something. I have Senator Marco Rubio on my board. He said at my annual dinner a year or two ago, he said, man, if I could assassinate every one of my political opponents and throw every journalist who criticizes me in prison, I'd win every election I ever ran in, right? Essentially is what goes on in Russia today. Ukraine is the country that can change Russia. It's not going to be the United States, but I think Ukraine can change Russia. We all watched when Zelensky came out of nowhere as a, quote, servant of the people and stormed the presidential election. That's Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare, right? A lot of the audience for Zelensky's servant of the people show was in Russia, not in Ukraine. And so I think this point about Ukraine being on the front line, that Ukraine's democratic integrity is not only a national security matter for the West, but it's central to our ambitions to empower Russians to build a different future for themselves, just like Ukrainians have so bravely sought to build a different future, not just Zelensky, but frankly, since the Orange Revolution. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And Robin.
I'm tempted to let other people just come in. I think I would just make one comment on Russia, then maybe I'll save up some comments about my views on British foreign policy towards the end. But from a UK perspective, obviously, managing Russia is going to be incredibly complicated. We've just had, for those of you who don't live here, last week a 3-day show on the murder of the attempted murder of the Skripals and all that flowed from it, and the death that took place in UK, and huge watchership, huge viewership, and a sense of the ordinary person getting caught up in these big machinations. So what's going to be very interesting, a UK outside the EU, as you may have an EU that is trying to develop a more balanced relationship with Russia because of its fear of the rise of China, because, as Toria and Andreas have said, put something in the shop window of what might be a relationship would be better, having to reconcile itself to Putin being in the Kremlin for another 12 or whatever years, perhaps. And Putin will feel he's gone through some dips in the polls before and always escaped. Maybe you'll think he can escape another time. It's going to make it very difficult for the UK to manage this Russia relationship effectively. And I feel we're going to be a little bit more of a passenger in that policy than a leader.
Thank you. We have Sophie Zinser, John Soares, and Ambassador Michaelis. I think I'll take two, Sophie and then Sir John. And if you introduce yourself. Sophie.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Leslie, and to Drs. Twining, Niblett, and Ambassador Victoria. My name is Sophie Zinser, and I'm proud to say that I'm newly an incoming Chatham House Academy Fellow studying China's pandemic response in the Middle East, and I'm currently residing in Hong Kong following the fascinating internal conflicts here and collaborations over the past few weeks between local BLM and local protest leaders. So based on Daniel's earlier comment on his on-the-ground experiences, I personally have found that local and international media narratives are critical to shaping localized perceptions of America's more democratic successes. So Karen Attia last month, I think, published a fantastic piece in the Post called How Western Media Would Cover Minneapolis If It Happened in Another Country. This to me was a powerful wake-up call to the American media's power in internally framing domestic and international unrest. So my big question is, how has the increasingly partisan nature of American media over the past decade, especially recent democratic uprisings and anti-Black racism uprisings inside the US, and maybe even China's propaganda apparatus's increasingly large role in controlling China's foreign policy, how are kind of all of these media factors influencing global perspectives of America's democratic resilience? Thank you all so much.
Great question. And Sir John.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Leslie. I'm John Soares, old friend and colleague of Toria's, and since left government. I spent a lot of my career trying to advance democracy in friendly countries which were not democratic, around the Middle East, for example. The speakers, Toria and Dan, have spoken a lot about democracy through coercion and against people who are sort of hostile to us. I wonder if they could say a few words about promoting democracy in friends to us who are more attracted by aligning themselves with Western power, but using Putin as a role model for maintaining power in their own country. And without going to names, there are quite a few of them around the Middle East, a few of them around Africa, and one or two in a number in Central Asia as well. Robin touched on the, in a sense, almost the overemphasis on elections and the underemphasis on the other elements of democracy, of accountability, of legitimacy, of independent institutions, of the rule of law, and so on. But it's a practical problem. We get tactical successes, but I feel democracy is on a retreat, not just in recalcitrants who are not going to change, like China and Russia in the foreseeable future, but amongst friendly countries to us. And that is a net setback for us. And we need to be somehow, not just through coercion and through sanctions, but finding practical ways to develop the institutions of democracy in these countries.
So two big questions. Shall I come to you first, Robin? Dan.
So just in response to Sir John, look, none of us are in favor of democracy through coercion. I liked Robin's point about protecting democracy earlier. I'd also like to just make the point that there's a supply-demand equation out there. And actually some of the greatest demand for accountability, for transparency, for leaders in political office who don't steal and bribe and corrupt, but actually respond to citizen concerns. Some of the greatest demands out there are in the Arab world, are in the Middle East, which is really the toughest environment for democratic freedom. To pick up something that Toria and Robin both said earlier and link it to Sir John's question, there is a direct link for sure between alliance partnership with a country like the United States or the UK, security cooperation, and internal political evolution. I think we've conveniently forgotten, but Robin's historical start maybe gives me an opening to say this. Japan was not a democracy in 1945. South Korea was not a democracy until actually the 1990s. Taiwan was run under martial law by a military strongman into the modern period, into the 80s and 90s. And I could go on and on. In NATO, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, before Turkey backslid. So our democratic alliances actually have incubated forms of political opening, which is a really valuable thing. And frankly, for countries like Vietnam that want to have much closer security partnership with the United States and other Western powers, there's always going to be a ceiling on security cooperation in a one-party Leninist state, right? And so I think there will be some internal pressures to reform over time. They're driven by the people, not from us. But this point that Toria made very powerfully, NATO was not just about holding the line in Europe. It was fundamentally about protecting democracy And it became a freedom project after the Cold War. And that was not because NATO went on some kind of imperialist adventure. It was because people behind the Iron Curtain for 45 years had wanted the same rights and open systems that Western Europeans had enjoyed. So I think sometimes we give ourselves a little too much agency, that actually it's people in these countries who want that greater transparency and accountability and openness. And all of those things in turn, those free institutions lead to the prosperity that, as Robin correctly points out, is so fundamental. I want to take on Sophie's question. Maybe I should turn to Toria, just so I'm not dominating here.
Okay, Ambassador Nuland, over to you. And then we'll have time for, I think, one more round before we finish promptly at our designated time of 3:15.
Well, first to Sophie's question, since it hasn't been addressed yet. Look, I think we all worry about the increasing partisan divide in media, not just in the United States, but in lots of democracies. And, you know, this is accelerated and turbocharged by digital media, where what you click on then gives you more of same through its algorithms. So I think this is part of the question of how we work on the technology economy to ensure that if a tech company is calling it news, it truly is nonpartisan and balanced, or at least gives viewers an aperture to that. I would say that in the United States and in lots of countries around the world, in the democratic world, we do still have a very strong tradition of investigative journalism, and that is essential for holding government to account, for holding public officials to account. And in the NED and IRI and NDI context, it is one of the strongest lines of support internationally, is to support investigative journalists and to enable them, particularly when they can't make a regular salary in their home countries, to have the ability to look behind the curtain of kleptocracy, et cetera. So I am not despairing, but there is certainly work to be done there, and you're good to highlight it, Sophie. On a broader question, I just want to put a stake in the heart of this promote democracy narrative. As Dan knows from our many NED meetings, I don't like the word. We should not promote democracy. You can't impose it, as we've all said. It has to be a citizen movement. It has to be empowering. It has to be individuals choosing their own future. What we can do is support democracy. To Sir John's point, you know, I think we make a mistake. We made a mistake in the Cold War in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when we aligned with governments, as Robin said, and he worried about for China, simply because they were anti-Soviet, regardless of how they were treating their own citizens or how they were responding to their citizens' demands, and often worked with very, very bad dictators. We can't fall back into that now, and we shouldn't, with Sisi or anybody else, be giving them a blank check when there is popular demand, popular movement inside their countries for more opportunity, more freedom, less stealing, more political pluralism. We should support those individuals, we should support those strands, and we should limit what we're willing to do with countries that are led by individuals who are suppressing those responses, starting with talking to them frankly about the fact that these kind of autocratic systems are inherently unstable, as we saw in 2011 across the Middle East, that you will do far better as a leader if you provide opportunity to your citizens, if you provide justice to your citizens, if you provide more individual rights and freedoms. And that the model gets more and more brittle and your leadership more and more imperiled the more you suppress. And frankly, I don't think, with some exceptions, we should be selling weapons to repressive countries either.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last comment, unless anybody else. And we have some tremendous people who are definitely not shy nor retiring, but haven't put their hands up. I give them one last opportunity to do so. You know who you are. But I'll turn to Mazen to ask a question. If anybody else wants to make a comment, please immediately put your name in the chat box. Mazen, over to you.
Thank you. Just a very brief background so you know where I'm coming from. So I spent, I think, maybe 18 years of my life as a student in the United States, as an HBS alumni, as an ambassador to the UK, and in other places, and a boarding school in the United Kingdom also. So Western values, along with my values from the Middle East and in Jordan, are very much instilled in me. I understand the values that we have here. I understand very well Western values, and they even became deeper when I was ambassador in the UK. It's probably a question and maybe a comment. And what I would like to say is that I've listened very, very interestingly and deeply to all the comments. My only advice is in the future, for, if I may, very humbly, with all my respect to the knowledge that you all have, is that when we speak about democratic values, I believe it's very important to speak about the human dimension. In the end, a nation state, when they were formed for the benefit of the people. How are the citizens benefiting the most? So are we just marketing a system regardless of what the outcomes are? Because we see Western forms of democracy, not in particular in Europe, United States, but in other places, that are misused. Actually, they are being used to take away rights and opportunities from other people. So they look democratic and they're Western democratic, but that system is used to deprive others from their rights. We also see, like in any country, that form of government, even in the West, as we see, as we live today in the United States, that there is a very big division. So in the end, what's the citizen in the end benefiting? And we see other places in the world.
Very important.
In the West, in other forms of government, where you see that there is an increasing benefit to the people. Their lifestyles have improved. I think it's very important to take this into dimension as we speak. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That's a tremendous comment. I think it clearly gets at a very big debate that you are all very well aware of. Let me add one question before I turn it to each of you for a final remark. I'll come to Daniel and then Victoria, and of course, Robin gets the last word. But I want to add, it is interesting that we haven't talked about human rights. Frequently, the democracy and human rights agenda get collapsed. Frequently, people do exactly the opposite and make the point that these are very different agendas. And I just am curious your thinking on that. And I do have to ask, the big question, which is, how concerned are you? How much do you think it matters? I was listening to you, Ambassador Nuland, talk about, saying to the people of Russia, do you really want this leader? And I could imagine Europeans saying the same thing to Americans about the forthcoming election. I mean, they say it all the time, not least Ed Luce, who says, Europe will give a pass to America once, but not twice. So if there is a re-election of the current president, then what? Perhaps you could add that into, because as we know, it doesn't look likely today, but it's certainly a very real possibility. And anything that you'd like to add, not least also to Robin's first comment, which I think was a really important one. Do we risk being in the, if you are anything you do that makes you against China means that you're on our side? Do you think that's a genuine concern or risk? And I guess I'd ask, you to answer that if you choose to address it, specifically in light of the very clear debates that you are engaged in within the foreign policy circles that you deal with in Washington. So over to you, Dan.
Okay, Ambassador Hammoud makes an excellent point that, sometimes we have these kind of high-level, top-down, sometimes romantic discussions about democracy. And in fact, at the end of the day, the test of any political system is, does it deliver for citizens? The good news is the record is quite strong. Every rich country in the world is a rule of law society with independent institutions, open media, et cetera, et cetera. Unless you happen to have been born on an oil field in a country like Saudi Arabia, if you are if you live in a high income country, you are living in an open system. Right? I had, amazingly, the leader of an organization, a democracy-related organization in Europe, say to me the other day that China puts the lie to that argument. I just want to share a number because I don't know if anyone else thinks that. Per capita income today in China is about $10,000. at market rates. Per capita income in America is something like $55,000. Oh, you might say we need to do PPP, purchasing power parity, to adjust for relative price differentials. Well, at PPP, China is at 18 and the US is at 67,000. And I think that number is replicated in Europe and elsewhere. So China is not actually an example of a high income country that has somehow made it. And Chinese leaders will be the first to tell you. But at the end of the day, a political system needs to deliver. And I think the greatest virtue of democracy, frankly, is not that everybody rows in the same direction. It's not that it cannot produce leaders that are suboptimal. In fact, the greatest quality is that it is self-correcting, and citizens get regular opportunities to participate. They have a voice, and they get to make a change. You saw what happened in America with our midterm congressional elections. We have a big election coming up. People can change the direction of a country in ways they cannot under an autocracy. And as Toria says, that creates rot and brittleness in an autocracy when one man, and it is usually a man, thinks that he is the answer and should rule for life. And usually that ends very badly. So democracies redeem themselves, I think, frankly, by showing the world their faults, including through a very free and open media, and then self-correcting.
Thank you, Ambassador Nuland.
I obviously couldn't have said it better. I think, you know, and that is the hope, and that's why we work for these things. I do think that in terms of self-correction, the democracies are more brittle today than they were because of the great income inequality that we're seeing across the transatlantic space and also among the Asian democracies. And so as we recover from this recession, as we take on the technology economy challenge and work to build back better, work to build back greener, how do we also bring more people into benefit? And how do we ensure that there is greater tax equality, et cetera, because that is part of the compact, that citizens are, that their lives are improving and not getting worse and more squeezed. And democracies have to pay attention to those issues. On the human rights and democracy, I think they are intertwined. Human rights is the third pillar of the democratic project. You can't have free societies if you don't have rights of the individual, if you don't have tolerance, if you don't have equal justice. Those are just fundamental. So you can't have government or anybody else exacting a toll on a class of people or a choice of individual choices of people in any category. It just doesn't work. Now that doesn't change the fact that it is part of the hard work of democracy in every generation to advance the cause of human rights, individual rights, freedoms for different classes that have been subjugated or faced discrimination. But tolerance is an essential quality of the fabric of democracy. On the China side, I think we have to be careful. This should not be about making a permanent enemy of China, nor should it be about aspiring to change the system. That is something for the Chinese people to choose. What it's about is saying to the Chinese state that if they want their nation to benefit from participation in the international system, from trade with us, from better relations with us, that they have to follow rules of openness, a level playing field, transparency, not simply in trade, but also in their political exchanges. They can't be buying off politicians, etc. And if they are not willing to play by those rules, then we're going to ensure that the benefits are restricted for them, and that their more predatory behaviors, including seeking to expand their surveillance space, et cetera, into our countries, are going to be met with firm resistance. So that we're going to protect our own security. We're going to be open to shared security, and shared prosperity, but only if they don't cheat the system. And that's what we need to work on. I do think it'll be a bipartisan issue. No matter who's elected in the United States, there will be a firm policy towards China. I think the bigger question is, will it be more effective than it's been and less up and down? And will we do it jointly with allies, which would be best? Before I leave you, I just want to make a UK point. We need every democracy to be at its strongest. Through my lifetime, historically, since the Magna Carta, the UK, the London, Britain has played the founding role in terms of advancing all of these principles. You've been distracted and rending your own fabric through Brexit these many last few years, exacerbated by our role here and other factors globally. At the end of all of this, the United States, democracies and democrats around the world need a strong UK. We need Great Britain out there defending these principles, not little England sinking out into the sea. So we're counting on you, and we hope to see you continue to aspire to play a strong role on the global stage. And thanks so much for having me here. It's been a great conversation with great friends.
Thank you for that. That was tremendous and very well put, I must say. Robin, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thanks, Leslie, for pulling this together and your team, and great comments. As Toria said just now, I thought Daniel gave the best kind of 1 minute, 2 minute exposition of the fundamental strengths of democracy, which I wholeheartedly endorse and agree with. Let me just say something quickly about the UK, back to Toria's points, and then close with a couple of comments on democracy to the questions that you posed. I think, Britain will play a good and constructive role in foreign policy and international affairs in the future. It's got the capacity, it's got the ambition, it's got the human skills and talent, and it's got some of the ideas I think will be incredibly valuable over time. It's got to learn how to be a contributor. It's a bit obsessed with trying to rediscover a past that I think is not on option. It's my personal view. The global Britain moniker that we're living right now is so wrapped up in slightly 19th century terms of free trade that they're missing some of the current agenda that the UK can, I think, play very powerfully in. And a lot of that role will be around values, about setting an example, about contributing to plurilateral and multilateral teams of countries trying to fix problems around shared values of openness and transparency, some of the agenda that we were discussing earlier in our agenda. I think we'll get there. It's just, to Toria's point, the UK is not out of rending itself quite yet. And obviously COVID-19 has set things back a little bit. And when it does do that, it will work with its European partners. It'll have no choice. 1,000 years of history will remind us of that. I think that democracy is just very interesting. On this point, as I said, I do believe it's the best system, the worst but best, as I think is the Churchill quick paraphrase. The question here, though, for this meeting has all been about the journey. What is the best journey? Is there a best journey to get there? Because we don't start here. As Toria said at the beginning, this is not the natural state of affairs. The natural state of affairs is to be led by the strong men, the powerful leading the others. So the question is, how can foreign policy influence that journey? And that's where the work of IRI, NED, respective organizations in European countries, the UK and others, is so important. And here, I'd say we mustn't get distracted by China. China is sui generis, in my opinion, by size, by history, by the fact that for a long time, although it was a one-party state, it did renew. It actually had a change of leadership option. What is so worrying for so many people, including me right now, is that under the current president, it appears to have given up that option and has gone back to a one-man leader for as long as we can see. And that really raises my worry, concern about China quite intensely. So the challenge for us is, I mean, not to get distracted about China in terms of the democracy story, but to really think about these countries that are in between. What do you do with the Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia with massive support amongst young people because of the new freedoms that have been offered to young people in Saudi Arabia, even though in so many other levels, it cuts against the values that we stand for. What do you do, Paul Kagame in Rwanda? So much support, women in the cabinet, incredible growth, but one-man leadership and definitely strong man. This is the space, the real business of foreign policy, is to try to keep the promise of these countries driving themselves in their own way towards more accountable government, and us helping, not promoting, to Toria and Daniel's point. And that's going to keep us all very busy, and certainly anyone involved in foreign policy.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Daniel Twining, Dr. Robin Niblett, and Ambassador Nuland. This was tremendous. I hope that you will continue to have this conversation with all of us. It's certainly core to our work across Chatham House. And of course, I am right there with Robin. I'm sure that the UK is going to be right back on board as soon as things begin to open up and move forward. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you to all of us for joining. Thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Stay in touch.
You always unmute and say goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Not switch off the feed too quickly.
Great conversation.
Bye, everyone. Bye.